Fran Drescher. Also joining us is Dr. Beth Carlin. She is a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Carlin, thank you also for being with us. Fran, let me start with you. You were diagnosed 20 years ago with uterine cancer. First of all, how's your health? How are you doing?
Thank God, knock wood, I'm doing great, and I'm very grateful. And I've turned my pain into purpose, and somehow that has made sense out of the senseless and got me on a whole trajectory of living a very pristine, toxic-free life and learning how to balance my stress and so many things that factor into dis-ease of the body. And of course, I go see my oncologist, Beth Carlin, once a year at least. And she's kind of my doctor for life now.
Dr. Carlin, let me ask you about the numbers. Are you seeing more diagnoses of uterine cancer and other kinds of gynecologic cancers?
Sure, Jean. Unfortunately, when we look at the success that we've had as a nation in our fight against cancer, uterine cancer is one that continues to increase year over year. For more than a decade now, there continues to be a rise in the number of cases of uterine cancer diagnosed in the United States and around the world. And unfortunately, we're also seeing a rise in the number of deaths. So despite the fact, Fran is cured of uterine cancer. But despite the fact that most women are diagnosed with early stage uterine cancer, we are seeing a more aggressive type more frequently. That is.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's part of it is there's a shift in some of the genetics and the folks who are at risk. The most common type of uterine cancer that's curable is often related to hormones. So obesity and our obesity epidemic in the US is part of the main reason for this rise. However, we're also seeing a rise in these, what we call type 2 cancers, due to a number of toxins in the environment, as Franz noted, but really genetics. And those toxins, what I mean is that they change the way the genes that would drive these cancers interact, and they don't stay limited to the uterus, which is when they're curable, but they can metastasize quite early. And our treatments yet are not able to affect cure in those situations.
Do you see that certain populations, you've mentioned obesity as a risk factor, but are there certain populations that appear to be more susceptible?
Well, we're seeing while there's a rise overall, we're seeing even more of a rise in the African American community. It's about 1% per year in the white community, but almost 2% per year in the African American community. Some of the incidence changes have to do with access to care and an awareness of the symptoms. And that's, again, why we're here today. Fran really was a great advocate. She knew something was wrong. And she made that part of her purpose to go find out what was wrong with her body.
Fran, I'm curious about that. I think most women know how to check for the symptoms of breast cancer, but many women, including myself, ignorant about the signs of gynecologic cancer. Why don't we know more? And what are you doing to change that?
For many women, when it's at the earliest and most curable whisper stage, it's very often misdiagnosed for other more benign problems. And this is particularly prevalent with gynecologic cancer. So I was misdiagnosed for 2 years and 8 doctors for a perimenopausal condition that I didn't have, when all the while I had uterine cancer, but I slipped between the cracks because historically I didn't fit the profile of a woman who I was really too young and too thin to be seriously considered for uterine cancer, even though 1 in 4 women are young and thin. And I just want to go back for a second to what Beth said, because she mentioned that it's a toxic environment that could be stimulating the genes to act out in an unfavorable way. And I just want to expand on that for a moment because genes have at least 28 different ways, a single gene, to express itself. So the more you exacerbate your health and well-being by exposing yourselves to a myriad of different toxins each and every day with the food you eat, the personal care items that you use, the cleaning and gardening products that you use, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The more you continuously do that, the more you're at risk of the gene expressing itself in an unhealthy way if it has that eligibility for that. So I think that in many ways, there is absolutely no downside for us all, no matter what your gender, no matter what your ethnicity, to really start looking at how you live. Because as we say at Cancer Schmancer, how you live equals how you feel, and you are what you eat. So, that definitely needs some looking at. And even though we're not talking about uterine cancer, I mentioned gynecologic cancer, and a lot of women are equally misdiagnosed for ovarian cancer, which is far more aggressive. Beth will tell you that one of my girlfriends she cured with ovarian cancer. And at that cancer's earliest and most curable whisper stage, it's very often misdiagnosed for IBS because at the cancer's whisper stages, that's kind of what it looks like. And a lot of doctors say, oh, it's IBS. They start treating you for IBS.
Fran's been a good student. Yeah, she's been a good
So,
student.
Dr. Carlin, obviously early diagnosis is key. And as
That's
Fran
right.
has just spelled out, a lot of the symptoms, it could be a symptom of
Are-
something else.
are not
So the question is, are the diagnostics getting better?
They're getting somewhat better, Jean. A lot of it still relies on patients coming forward, having access to care. For uterine cancer, the most common symptom is abnormal uterine bleeding. After menopause, you should not be seeing pink on toilet tissue. Women are very used to pelvic symptoms, or they get used to it because they've dealt with menstrual cramps perhaps over years, or they've been pregnant and dealt with, the pregnancy changes, and they often ignore some of those things as just physiologic, and they really aren't when you get past menopause. The diagnostics have greatly improved, believe it or not, for cervix cancer, which is, not a very common disease. We now almost think pap smears are going to become obsolete because cervix cancer can be diagnosed with an HPV, with a screen of the DNA in the vagina. So that's a huge advance. For uterine cancer, there aren't a lot of new diagnostics. It's really the awareness of coming in for the bleeding and then having a biopsy, which is a simple office procedure. Simple for me and not too hard for the patient either. For ovarian
What about
cancer,
genetic screening? Would genetic screening be useful?
incredibly helpful. We're not ready yet for population-based screening, meaning everyone when you go into your doctor should have your genetics. I think we're heading in that direction. It's really about, can we target it? I think one of the most important things we can do, and as we now think about Thanksgiving, we may be Zooming with families, is to know your family history. It is so powerful. Over 20% of ovarian cancers are related to inherited genetics, and about 13% of uterine cancers are related to inherited genetics. So that can really be a key. There's certain populations that should have the genetic testing done. Those who are of Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish heritage have a higher risk of carrying some of these genes. And the United States Preventative Services Task Force has come out and suggested that men and women in that population should at least consider having testing for the genetic risk.
Is it accessible and is it affordable?
So yes and yes. Well, yes and yes. So it is very accessible. It can be done even by saliva. So in these times of COVID, when we speak to men and women who meet the criteria, all it is really spitting in a tube and mailing it in. The DNA cells that come out from your cheek are just as good as a blood test. Affordable, if you meet the national guidelines, insurers do cover it. There are some some challenges at times with folks who are underinsured or uninsured. Many of the testing companies will provide that testing. One point of caution, if I may quickly, some of the over-the-counter direct-to-consumer genetic testing that we see in the pharmacies and all don't test completely for the cancer-causing genes. And when they do, they only test for 3 changes in the Jewish population. So they don't test, those results don't help you at all if you're not in that population. And in fact, those tests are not at medical grade, so they would need to be confirmed before acting on them.
Beth, can I ask you a question?
Anything.
You know, Beth and I, by the way, went to Washington and successfully got the first Gynecologic Cancer Education and Awareness Act passed by unanimous consent, which means all 100 senators said yes. And I have tried to get the transvaginal ultrasound as part of basic healthcare, gynecologic healthcare for women, because what are your thoughts on hyperplasia as a precursor for uterine cancer? And I don't believe that the traditional, what I think is pretty archaic at this point, bimanual, abdominal thing is accurate, but at least maybe with a ultrasound.
So Fran, so what Fran's referring to, everybody, is that every month when women have a period, the endometrium, which we're talking about as the cause of the cancers here, is the lining of the uterus, and that sheds off. If it doesn't shed off because you're postmenopausal and it keeps growing, it's like having a lawn that's not mowed. So it's hyperplastic. It has these very long glands that can then become malignant. It is a pre-malignant state. We have studies for over 100 years that demonstrate that. That's usually what leads to some spotting and allows us to make this early diagnosis. So that's why it's so helpful. Transvaginal ultrasound is not a standard of care because of all the false positives and its lack of sensitivity and specificity for getting the cancer diagnosis. I think it is much better than a bimanual pelvic exam, Fran. You're absolutely right. And I don't know how much a screening pelvic exam necessarily helps.
Well, if you saw hyperplasia before bleeding, maybe that might prompt you to do an endometrial biopsy.
Yeah, I think the gold standard is, are we saving lives with these interventions? So will the screening test translate not just into finding the cancer a bit earlier, but does that indeed translate into more cures? And we're still fighting that, figuring that out with mammograms and PSAs. We know pap smears or cervical cancer screening really does save lives. And that really is the gold standard. But just seeing what we call a downshift in stage doesn't always translate into saved lives. And we're still working on that. Clearly, we need something better than just a pelvic exam.
We're almost out of time, but Beth, at the beginning, you mentioned that the mortality rate is going up for these cancers. Why? Why is it continuing to go up if you're diagnosing them?
Because we're seeing many more of these type 2, well, for this diagnosis of endometrial cancer, we're seeing many more of these high-grade tumors that that metastasize early. So even though they present with the spotting like the others, under the microscope, there are different cell types that spread very early. And we just don't have good treatments, adjuvant treatments. We need more funding for research. I will put in that plug, because that's really where the answers are going to come. Right now, we do have chemotherapy, radiation, and some targeted treatments, and they are allowing women to live longer, but they're not affecting cure.
And there, unfortunately, we have to leave it. Dr. Beth Carlin, Fran Drescher, thank you both for joining us.
Lots of room for hope.
Thank you for doing this, and we're
take care.
To be a part of it.
And to view the final results of our polling questions, just click back over the poll and you'll be able to see those. I want to give a big thank you to our moderators and our panelists, and of course to our underwriters, Bristol Myers Squibb and Amgen Oncology. And thanks also to all of you for watching and for putting in your wonderful questions. We would like to hear about your reaction to what happened today. We'd love your input. We could use it in designing future programs. So there are a couple of ways you can do that. One, click on the chat on your screen. You will find a survey there. Also, you will be sent a survey via email when this event concludes. Please take the time to complete